morning, Reptilians. Welcome and welcome back to my channel. So this week's video is probably going to be a little bit shorter than usual, but I thought it was kind of important because yet again, this is a question that I get asked kind of often, and it's just about reptile enrichment and what kind of enrichment you can provide to certain types of reptiles. Before we get started about what kind of enrichments are best, let's quickly talk about what enrichment is. Enrichment is something for your reptiles to do. I know that there are a lot of people, especially big breeders, that keep reptiles in just plastic tubs with absolutely nothing in there. Studies show over and over again that this is really bad for the health of your animal, but I did a whole video on the importance of enrichment that I will leave here if you guys want to check that out. So today I thought I'd just kind of go into detail about what kind of enrichment works for certain reptiles. Before we get started, this video is sponsored by iheartgeckos, so make sure to stay until the end of this video to find out more about this amazing company. Let's get started. The first one we're going to talk about is arboreal creatures, and we're going to heavily focus on humidity-loving / arboreal reptiles for this. In my opinion, arboreal animals are the easiest to provide enrichment for because you can take advantage of the entirety of the tank and just fill it with so much enrichment. Especially if we talk about the more common humid species of arboreal reptiles like crested geckos, morning geckos, day geckos, girl geckos, all of those sorts of things. We can do a whole bunch of fake plants, suction cup them to the sides, have vines hanging down. They absolutely love vines. They need things to crawl on, and you can do that in so many ways. You can buy the pre-made vines. You can use something like PVC pipe to create that effect. So many options there. You also can do things like hanging hides for them. With an arboreal animal, yes, they're going to hide in that, but it also is going to give them something else to climb on, something else to explore. If the vine aesthetic isn't your thing, driftwood is also wonderful in arboreal creatures tanks because you can get really big pieces and put them diagonally in that tank and they will utilize it. You can change driftwood out if you want to, because changing out enrichment is good for your animal. Changing it out crazy often is going to be stressful. You shouldn't be changing enrichment out daily for these animals, but changing it every so often is going to give them a new place to explore. That gives them something new to do. Another thing that arboreal animals love are bridges and hammocks. Now, if this is a New Caledonian sort of humid gecko or reptile, then be careful with what materials you're using for this. Using cloth in a humid tank could mold, and obviously that's not great. But again, it's giving them something else to do and it's adding more layers to that tank. Cork bark is really good in these sorts of tanks because a lot of times they are long and tall and hollow, and they do really good with humidity. Waterfalls. There are a lot of really cool fountains and waterfall systems that you can get, and they basically just create more humidity and they drip water, so you're adding sounds and your animal can go and actually drink from it. And a thing that I love doing with those humid loving arboreal creatures are bioactive tanks. Bioactive tanks are wonderful for humidity loving arboreal creatures. You can do so much with a bioactive tank, and it gives a lot of enrichment because you are sort of replicating their natural environment. Obviously, in the wild, they're not around a bunch of plastic plants, so being able to put real plants in there helps so much. They will drink from the plants, they will climb around on them, the plants provide more oxygen for them, and bioactive setups have loose substrate, so they are getting down in that. There are isopods and springtails and all of those things in that substrate, which is, again, something else in that tank. And yeah, bioactive setups are amazing sources of enrichment for these animals. Next up, we're going to look at terrestrial / more arid loving reptile tanks. So obviously some of this is going to be the same. Driftwood is still going to be wonderful, especially if it's more of a semi-arboreal animal, even if it's a ground, just straight up ground species like a blue-tongued skink. Driftwood is great for them to climb over and have something to walk over, so it's not just a flat, empty area. Things like fake plants are still going to be helpful, having them on the ground, having them where your animal can kind of slide through them, explore them, climb around them, whatever, that's going to be wonderful for enrichment. Obviously, if it's a completely terrestrial animal, having them hanging up like you would in an arboreal tank isn't going to provide much in the way of enrichment for them. It's going to make the tank look better, but it's not really going to provide more of enrichment for them. So make sure that even if you put plants around the sides, you do still have them on the ground as well. Rocks are a really good one as long as your species isn't going to be known to burrow under those rocks. You can get a lot of really cool, large rocks for them to climb around, and also a lot of times this will help with them shedding. If it does have some rough surfaces on it, this is something that they're going to use to rub up against to shed, which is another huge pro to this. A lot of enrichment can also be used for other purposes, which is awesome. Having different kind of hides will also help, especially if you have something like a leopard gecko. Having a humid hide is going to help them shed, and also it is enrichment. It's another hide for them to climb around in. If you put things like sphagnum moss, that other kind of substrate is something else for them to feel. It's another texture. Having different kinds of substrate is going to be wonderful for these guys too. Again, going back to leopard geckos, in one of my leopard gecko tanks, I have about 3/4 tile and 1/4 of a dig spot. So her going over there and digging every day is a wonderful form of enrichment. Leopard geckos love to dig, and as long as it's a safe substrate, then you're fine. For things like bearded dragons or even corn snakes, low-hanging bridges and hammocks are always wonderful. Most people, I feel like, that have bearded dragons have some sort of hammock or bridge in that tank, because bearded dragons very much like to climb and will climb up there and sleep in those things. But you can use those things for other animals too. And where possible, water dishes can also be a form of enrichment. A lot of snakes and lizards will soak in those water bowls. That is another surface that they are hanging out in, and that is always wonderful if at all possible. If it is a super dry sort of species, then obviously a water dish isn't going to be applicable there. But if possible, large water dishes are wonderful. And the last thing we're going to talk about are burrowing creatures. These are a little more difficult because if your animal spends all of its time underground, it's kind of hard to give them things to do. So for these kinds of animals, the biggest form of enrichment is just going to be making sure that they have a loose substrate. You do not want to take an animal that naturally burrows and put them on something like paper towels, because you are completely taking away their natural urge to want to dig under that ground, because they can't. So for example, our corn snake, yes, they do climb and stuff. He's not completely a burrowing animal, but he does love to burrow. So we make sure that we always have aspen in there. Aspen is wonderful for corn snakes because it is very dry, and corn snakes do like a dry environment. It's loose, so he can get in there and make his tunnels and do whatever he wants to do. For my blue-tongued skink, Morty, who burrows very often, he is an Aryan giant blue-tongued skink, so he does like a little bit of humidity. So his substrate is Pro Cocoa and Eco Earth and sphagnum moss mixed together. So it's a very soft, loose substrate. You can still give them hides, just make sure that they're not heavy. Make sure that it isn't something that you are setting on top of that substrate that is going to collapse if they burrow underneath it. But you can still give them light hides, or hides that are tall enough that they'll go all the way to the floor, because that'll give them some other place to dig out if they need to. Fake plants are still going to be helpful sometimes. I would suggest not going out and spending an insane amount on fake plants, maybe just some Dollar Tree plants thrown on top. That way they can burrow around it, or if it falls through, it doesn't matter. They're just light fake plants. Like, these are wonderful just to add something in there, and that'll make the tank look better for you also, instead of it just being substrate. And if they happen to come up, it is there for them to mess around in. Underground tunnels are awesome if you can do that for your animals. When we did our reacting to subscriber tanks last week, the week before, whatever week that was, we saw someone that had paper towel rolls as tunnels for their ball python, I want to say, or corn snake. I don't remember, but that was a really good idea. You could even bury something like that if it's a dry animal, if it's not going to cause those paper towel holders to mold. And they can climb around in there, and instead of just pure substrate, they have now these nooks and crannies that they have to burrow around while they're under there. So it's just an idea. Underground tunnels would be wonderful to change up the scenery for them. Anything you do to change up your animal's tank can be enrichment. So apart from those physical things, quickly let's talk about other forms of enrichment for all animals. Number one, a huge one, is changing what kind of food they are eating. As in, not giving them the same food every single day, every single meal. Giving them new foods helps so much, especially if you have a bearded dragon, and instead of just giving them a green salad every day, if you are throwing in butternut squash or strawberries, or just throwing in colors and textures and shapes, is going to give them a form of enrichment because it's changing things up. Giving your animals different bugs if they eat bugs. Don't always give them the same thing. Even something as simple as throwing in one new kind of feeder once a week helps. It gets them away from that mundane eating experience, because like I always say, you wouldn't want to eat the same thing all day every day, and neither does your animal. If you have something like a snake, instead of just tongue feeding the rodent to them all the time, maybe try putting the rodent in a certain spot and having them come out and hunt for it. Something as simple as that can make a huge difference. Taking your animal out of their enclosure is a wonderful way to give enrichment. When I take Zaz out, usually the first thing she does is goes to the window on my couch and hangs out at the window. That has become her little spot. If possible, please don't do this if it is any kind of risk at all to your animal for any kind of reason. But if you can, taking your animals outside is wonderful. They get access to fresh air and sunlight, and they have all kinds of new textures and sounds and bugs, and there's so much going on around them, and that does wonders. It is something that I like to do for Zaz, especially. I took Morty outside for the first time in a previous video, and he loved it so much. It's something that they enjoy, and something that I recommend if you can. If you have any kind of chemicals sprayed on your lawn, if you have any kind of pesticides, or if there's any kind of risk of them being eaten by a dog or anything like that, please don't take them outside. But if possible, and if safe, I do recommend that. But that's about it for this week's video. I know that in my importance of enrichment video a while back, I did talk about the different kinds of enrichment, but I do get a lot of questions about what can I put in my tank, and so I just wanted to go into details and give you some ideas of things that you can possibly put in those tanks. Hopefully that was helpful if you were looking for some ideas for things to put in your animals' enclosures. As I said at the beginning of this video is sponsored by iheartgeckos. iheartgeckos, as you guys know, is one of my favorite reptile companies. They make awesome conversion kits for your arboreal animals. They allow you to take any old aquarium that you may have laying around and turn it into a vertical standing front opening tank for your arboreal creatures at a very good cost. You're gonna save so much money getting that as opposed to trying to get a store brand front opening tank. Like I always say, this tank has been set up for well over a year now, and it's doing wonderfully. It looks just like it did when I very first set it up. If you guys are interested in purchasing any of this at iheartgeckos.com, make sure to leave me, Elle's Reptiles, in the How Did You Hear About Us box, so that way they know that you guys are coming from these videos. Thank you so much to iHeartGeckos for sponsoring this video. As always, if you have not already, please feel free to follow me on my other socials and like, subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications every single time I put out a new video, which is every Sunday. This week's Instagram shout out goes to Alan Barrett 3348 for following me on Instagram and going through and liking a whole bunch of my stuff. And the subscriber shout out goes to Kevin Barty. I'm so sorry if I said that wrong, for always being super supportive and commenting on all of my videos. Thank you guys so much. You are the bee's knees. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic day. Bye. Let's into a actually beginning and actually are giving them safe burrowing. So just make sure you're giving us, so just make sure that is just an idea. So that is just an idea for, so that's just an idea. Underground tunnels would probably